Hello friends. Hebrews chapter 12 from verse 25. See that you do not refuse the one who is speaking. For if they did not escape when they refused the one who warned them on earth, how much less will we escape if we reject the one who warns from heaven? At that time his voice shook the earth, but now he has promised, yet once more I will shake not only the earth, but also the heavens. The phrase, yet once more, indicates the removal of what is shaken, that is, created things, so that which cannot be shaken may remain. Therefore, since we are receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken, let us give thanks, by which we offer to God an acceptable worship with reverence and awe, for God is a consuming fire. Our God is a consuming fire. Hebrews chapter 12 verses 18 to 29 summarizes the lessons that are given through chapters 11 and 12 of the letter to the Hebrews. Those living under the new covenant have the advantage of looking to Christ rather than to the law. The Old Testament was given through ominous signs, grave messages warning of dire consequences for disobedience, fire and sacrifice. And the holy mountain where Moses met with God was not approachable for ordinary people. God dwelt there at the top of the mountain, and God was so holy that no ordinary person dared to approach that mountain, let alone touch it. And so the Old Testament really was full of external worship and laws and rituals and ways of obeying God's requirements and requirements for ritualistic sacrifices and so on and so forth. And God in the Old Testament appeared to be unapproachable in his holiness. The new covenant offers something better, something that is beyond rituals, that is not confined to the physical and the material. Christ gives us the freedom to approach God with confidence, although, of course, we approach God with proper reverence at the same time. What is offered to us in Christ is unchangeable and unshakable. We have a new freedom, and the worship that we offer God reflects this new freedom that we have. A freedom from fear of God, a freedom from being obligated to hold to rituals and traditions religiously and to fulfill them absolutely in every detail. A freedom to come close to the altar of God, to approach God without having to cower in fear in case God should find us unacceptable and should punish or judge us and cast us out from his presence. So in the Old Testament, there was no real sense of God's closeness or compassion a lot of the time. And under the new covenant, we are very conscious of a warm and personal and approachable and loving and compassionate God. And so the writer to the Hebrews is stressing, really throughout the book, how superior this new covenant is to the old covenant, how fortunate we are that we belong to this new covenant and that we have this wonderful freedom and so on. Now, at the end of chapter 12, we read a phrase, acceptable worship. And so I want to talk a little bit about what it means to offer God acceptable worship. Does it mean that there is a right way to worship God and a wrong way? And if that is true, what defines acceptable worship? What are the requirements for acceptable worship? If worship is acknowledging how great and infinite and mysterious and incomprehensible God is, and expressing this sense of mystery with awe and reverence, then how do we do it? How do we worship? When do we worship? Worship proclaims that God is worthy. Does God need to be told that God is worthy? Richard Rohr says that Jesus said, "Follow me." He didn't say, "Worship me." It is true, of course, that Jesus refers to worship of God the Father. And we'll remember that incident where he went into the temple and he turned over the tables. He was furious because they'd turned a house of prayer into a den of iniquity. And so Jesus certainly saw the importance of prayer and worship, but he never demanded that his disciples or anybody else worship him personally. Jesus said, "Follow me." He didn't say, "Worship me." But Richard Rohr suggests that too much energy is spent on worshipping God and not enough on following Jesus. If we focus too much on worship, then we will find that there are all sorts of different styles, different ways of worship, and we will hold to one particular style and we won't be comfortable in all sorts of other styles. So worship can kind of divide us if we're focusing on how we worship, if we're just kind of comfortable with our particular tradition of worshiping God. So, in fact, we ought to be focusing more on following Jesus than worshipping Jesus. Following Jesus is a great deal more challenging and a great deal more costly than worshipping him. And I think that it is important for us to acknowledge that worship, when we are worshipping together with a group of people at the Sunday service or in somebody's home, whatever it might be, it doesn't have to be outward and demonstrative and exuberant in order to be real worship. Too often, there's a great divide between our worship and our behavior and our attitudes and our values and our prejudices. So that's why, of course, the church has been referred to as a bunch of hypocrites through the generations, because we appear to be caught up in wonderful worship on a Sunday at church, but then the rest of the week our lives just don't measure up at all. In fact, our lives are hollow. Now, for me, my stock response to that is at least those who are involved in the spiritual life acknowledge their hypocrisy, and that's commendable. So we're not claiming that we are pure and perfect by any means. But anyway, it's far more important that our lives express our worship. Every sort of detail of our lives, that our lives express our worship, rather than that we have experiences of being lifted up to the third heaven, whatever that means. So we don't need all these wonderful spiritual experiences. One of the dangers of worship is that we can, in a sense, become addicted to worship, and it is very personal and individual and almost self-indulgent, because it's like God and I are wrapped up, huddled up in a relationship together, and it's wonderfully cozy when it's just the two of us together and I am involved in worshiping and praying. If our worship challenges us and changes us, then it is a good thing, because real worship should be transformative. If we genuinely encounter the real God, then some things in our lives are going to kind of crumble, give way, and we're going to be remolded into the image of Christ. But the problem is that for so many people, worship is not transformative. So we are so entrenched in our lives and in our attitudes and in our patterns of living that our habits and attitudes and prejudices remain intact. It doesn't matter how much we worship, we remain the same. When Paul saw a vision of Jesus on the Damascus Road, I guess that was a kind of worship experience. He fell to the ground. He was obviously overawed, overwhelmed by meeting God in the person of Jesus on that road. He was confronted with the truth about who Jesus is, who God is, confronted by the truth of who he is, and the fact that he's been completely wrong in his understanding of what it means to be a good, God-fearing Pharisee. He's confronted by the fact that his behavior has been entirely opposed to God's will, when he's gone about destroying households and throwing men and women into prison because of their allegiance to this Christ. So Paul then, through that Damascus experience, was completely changed, and he dedicated the rest of his life to serving Christ, establishing churches, preaching the gospel, serving Christ. Perhaps Paul's encounter on the Damascus Road expresses what true and acceptable worship is. It is coming into, was being suddenly aware of the awesome presence of God, and feeling spontaneously and instinctively a smallness and an unworthiness, and I guess having one's sin exposed to some extent. No one engineered that situation when Paul met Jesus on the Damascus Road. It was completely unexpected, and there was no attempt at dramatic effect. To make worship the goal and focus of our lives means that it is like an addiction, a drug, an escape, so that we do not have to face the reality of our difficult lives and situations, our pain, and our unwhole relationships. So worship is really important, but we shouldn't get it out of perspective. Perhaps a definition of true acceptable worship is any occasion in our lives when we are suddenly enlivened by a force larger than ourselves. This is Richard Rohr once again. When we are suddenly enlivened by a force larger than ourselves. And I quote, "When we see someone doing good in the world, that is a sign of God. When we see a newborn baby, or watch a beautiful sunset, or the waves crashing on a beach, that is a sign of God. These signs can be a physical gesture, can be a word or a smile, or a meal together with those we love. Any occasion when we are drawn out of ourselves, when we become conscious of something greater than ourselves, perhaps responding instinctively to something that we see or experience. God often uses goodness, truth, and beauty to grab our attention. Of course, as C.S. Lewis says in The Problem of Pain, God also uses pain to grab our attention. But here we're talking about worship, and so we need to be able to see goodness and to recognize truth and to be spellbound by beauty. And in these experiences, our hearts will be lifted to worship. Being alive to God's presence in these simple things so that we instinctively respond with joy, thrilled by something that has moved us. This is worship. Being alive to God's presence in the ordinary. This is worship. I love being with a congregation and singing heartily, and I participate very noisily in singing hymns and songs. I sing loudly and enthusiastically, and maybe not always in the right key, but I really enjoy it. And I think a lot of us do that, and that's the reason why so many of the traditional hymns are so wonderful. We know them so well. We've sung them all our lives, and we want to give it great gusto. But I think that singing great hymns and wonderful spiritual songs is more for our own enjoyment than and edification than it is for God's enjoyment, because we are all governed by our personal preferences and so on. It makes us feel good to be singing lustily these wonderful hymns and songs. We need to be built up and encouraged, but maybe God cares more about my ability to respond to God's presence in the ordinary than he cares about how loudly I sing in church services. We can't really separate prayer and praise and worship and adoration and meditation and contemplation. We can't really divide them up, and sometimes one will flow into the other. But of course, at any particular time, we might be trying to focus on one form of prayer. But worship means being conscious of a presence that is bigger than I am, that draws me out of myself, that makes me aware of mystery, that makes me thrill and wonder. Every now and again, too, when we are flooded with a spirit of gratitude and even just plain contentment, in such a way that we respond quietly, expressing what we feel in simple words and gestures. This too is worship. It's not so much about bowing our heads and kneeling at the altar rail and following the liturgy properly and flinging our arms in the air and waving them and clapping our hands, and it's not so much about all these bodily postures and so on, and rituals and traditional ways of worshipping, although they might be helpful and meaningful. Worship involves being amazed that we should matter, that God should be aware of us because we are so small, so seemingly insignificant in the grand scheme of things. Worship involves being mystified and awed by God's greatness. Worship involves being moved by the ordinary but wonderful things that people do, and by great beauty and great revelations of truth about God and ourselves and other people and creation. Worship involves being conscious of the fact that we are connected to all of life. In worship, we bring our whole lives before God humbly. Worship involves allowing truth to challenge and change us. We can't worship God without recognizing the dignity of other people. Our relationships and our attitudes matter. I think that's really important, because our worship can never be genuine worship if we're harboring broken relationships or resentment and bitterness, signifying that we're not in harmony with people. The writer to the Hebrews implies that by giving thanks to God, we are offering acceptable worship to Him. And so today, I hope that we'll be encouraged to think about what constitutes worship in our own lives. How do we worship? When do we worship? Where do we worship? If we're in the habit of going to church, do we feel that that is a genuine experience of worship? If we're out of the habit of going to church services, how do we worship God? How do we sense the presence of this great being that is bigger than we can imagine, bigger than we can conceive of? And how does that worship happen? How are we lifted through ordinary experiences by recognizing the presence of the divine? And so what does worship really mean for you and for me? How do we do it? And how important is worship for us? And how does it make us feel? Worshipping, I think, is very therapeutic. It takes us out of ourselves, and we try to focus on God. And as we worship, so there is the opportunity for God's Spirit to do some healing work in us. And so we are encouraged today to consider how we can offer to God an acceptable worship, remembering that the writer to the Hebrews says that it is to a large extent by thanksgiving that we're able to offer that acceptable worship to God. And so I pray that God will be with you and bless you as you continue to live with Him and worship and serve Him, and as He continues to be real to you and to journey with you in your own life. Amen, and God bless.